Every small station has one appliance that hates you personally. Ours was the fuse board. It went up in a shower of orange sparks at 11 at night, took the radio with it, and left me standing in the dark with a screwdriver and a very short list of options. I do not carry a spare fuse. Nobody does at that hour in a town this size. What I had was a gum wrapper, the spring out of a retractable pen, and 40 seconds before the backup battery gave out too. Foil bridges a circuit almost as well as copper if you fold it right and you are willing to lose the skin off 2 fingers doing it. The radio coughed back to life exactly as the harbor frequency lit up with a call I almost missed. A ferry, engine dead, drifting, a body on board. I remember thinking absurdly that the night had already used up its one disaster. It had not even started. The MS Nordstern was 40 minutes out of harbor when her engine died, which happens in winter to old boats with older engines. What does not happen normally is a passenger found in the generator room 2 hours later on his back, a burn across both palms that told a story his throat could not, because his throat was already blue. Captain Solberg met me at the rail with the particular calm of a man who has already decided this is someone else's problem now. The storm was 4 hours out. The Coast Guard was 5, which meant, for at least 1 hour, it was just me, a dead man, and every other soul on that ferry, sealed inside 200 feet of steel with nowhere to go and no one to call. Torvald Nystrom kept the books for half the fishing companies on this coast, which sounds boring until you learn what a good bookkeeper actually sees. 3 boats belonging to the same shipping group had sunk in the last 6 years, each one insured to the hull for more than it was worth, each one lost in weather that sank nothing else that night. Torvald had signed off on all 3 claims. He had also, according to a friend of his, started refusing to sign a 4th. He had a meeting scheduled with an insurance investigator on Monday. He did not make it to Monday. Petter Lang, who ran the shipping group and had known Torvald for 20 years, called him a brother on the phone that night before he knew Torvald was dead. I have learned to distrust the word brother when it arrives before the coroner does. 5 people had a reason to be near that generator room. Captain Solberg, who signs the manifest and therefore signs for everyone on it. Rune Halvard, the engineer, who knows every valve on that boat with his eyes closed. Petter Lang, the business partner with 3 suspicious insurance claims and a 4th about to be exposed. Astrid Volume 50, Torvald's former fiancée, who had not spoken to him in 2 years and was against every odd on this exact crossing. And 1 passenger who gave no name sat in the corner of the lounge with a hood up and answered every question with fewer words than the question contained. 5 people, 1 generator room, and a storm that would erase every wet footprint before the Coast Guard arrived to care about them. The burns across both palms were clean, symmetrical, the kind you get gripping something live for longer than your body is telling you to. Not an accident with a tool, a choice, or a trap. His shoes were dry. The floor around him was not, and it had not come from outside. The salt content was wrong. Fresh water, engine cooling water, pooled from somewhere above the deck plates. Someone had opened a line on this man, briefly, deliberately, and then closed it again before walking away and leaving him to die of what looked, to a tired eye, like an accident with old machinery. I crouched there in the cold and the diesel smell, and thought the same clean thought I always think in rooms like this. Whoever did this understood exactly how this room kills, and wanted it to look like the room did it alone. Astrid Volume 50 had a burn scar on her right wrist, old, years old. And when I asked about it, she went very still before she told me a story about a stove that did not quite hold together under questions. She had also, a steward remembered, argued with Torvald in the lounge the night before. Voices raised, something about money he owed her from the engagement that ended badly. A burn, a motive, a witness. Captain Solberg did not wait for me to finish the sentence. He had her escorted to a cabin and the door locked from the outside, and the mood on that ferry lifted like someone had opened a window. Passengers who had been eyeing each other for 2 hours started making small talk again. It is a specific kind of relief watching a crowd decide the danger is over. I have felt it before from the wrong side of it. I did not lock my own door. A stove burn and a generator burn do not look the same. Not if you have seen enough of both, and Astrid's scar was the wrong shape, the wrong age, healed in a pattern that matched nothing in that engine room. I stood outside her locked door for a long moment, listening to the relief spread through the boat like heat through a hull, and I felt the particular loneliness of being the only person still doing the math. Everyone wanted this solved in 1 hour, so the storm could be the worst thing that happened tonight. I wanted it solved correctly. Those are not always the same wish. Somewhere on this boat, someone who understood valves, pressure, and cold water a great deal better than a bookkeeper's jilted fiancé was still walking around free, and still had a reason to make sure I stopped looking. I pulled the engine log. Only one set of hands had signed in and out of that generator room in the 6 hours before Torvald died, and they belonged to Liv Halvorsen, which meant nothing on its own, because it was, after all, his room to sign in and out of. But the lock on that door was a hasp and padlock, old style, the kind you can only close from outside, and someone had closed it, briefly. Around the time the burns happened, according to a scuff mark fresh in the paint that had not been there on yesterday's maintenance photo, Rune had a key. So did the captain. So, it turned out, did Petter Lang, who had sailed this route enough times to have earned 1 year ago and never returned it. 3 keys. One valve only an engineer would trust himself to touch in the dark, in a moving boat, without looking. I went back down alone, which I will admit, in hindsight, was the one decision on this boat I would like to have back. I wanted 5 minutes with that valve before the storm hit, and the whole crossing turned into noise and water and no time to think. Rune had been up on deck a minute earlier, checking lines against the weather, and I remember being glad he was somewhere else. I was wrong about that too. The door shut behind me with the same sound Torvald must have heard, and I mistook it, for exactly 1 second, for the wind. The hasp clicks shut on the outside, and I already know, before I try the handle, that it will not move. Somewhere behind me, a valve I did not touch is open, and the bilge is filling faster than any storm could explain. Not a leak, a choice. I have maybe 6 minutes before the water reaches the generator housing, and the moment salt water meets a live coil in a steel room, everyone standing on this deck is standing on a conductor. First idea, shut the valve myself. I get 2 turns before the wheel spins loose in my hand. Useless. The mechanism stripped from the inside on purpose. Somebody planned this before tonight. Water at my ankles, then my shins. I need 2 things that do not exist down here. A way to move the water out faster than it comes in, and something to plug a valve I cannot close. The fire hose on the bulkhead is meant for smoke, not floods, but hose is hose, and gravity does not care what the manufacturer intended. I run it up through the ventilation shaft out above the waterline, and it starts to siphon, slow, stubborn, barely winning. Not enough, not alone. There is a drum of engine oil bolted to the wall, heavy, viscous, exactly the wrong thing to spill near sparks, and exactly the right thing to jam a mouth open by force. I wedge the drum's spout into the valve housing and lean my whole weight into it until the metal screams and holds. The water climbs to an inch below the generator coil. Stops, just stops. Somewhere above me, thunder, or maybe it is just my own pulse, I genuinely cannot tell anymore. The lights flicker once, twice, and stay on. I sit down in 6 inches of freezing water because my legs have simply finished for the night. And I laugh, once, badly. The way you laugh at things that were not funny until you survived them. Solberg found the door 40 minutes later when the storm finally loosened its grip enough for anyone to hear pounding over the wind. I came up soaked to the collarbone and colder than the water had any right to make me, and the first thing I did before anyone could hand me a blanket was bag the valve wheel. The stripping on the mechanism was not rust. It was filed on purpose, recently, by someone who knew exactly which part of that valve to ruin, so it would fail silently under pressure. That is not a bookkeeper's sabotage. That is not a jilted fiance's sabotage. That takes a hand that has taken this exact valve apart 100 times and knows precisely where it is weak. Liv Halvorsen had worked the Nordstjern's engine room for 11 years, long enough to know every valve like the back of his own hand, long enough to have filed that mechanism weeks ago and waited for the right crossing. He had also, I learned from the shift roster, worked 3 previous ferries in the same shipping group. All 3 of them retired early from service after expensive, well-timed mechanical failures, not sinkings, near misses. The kind that get quietly written off and quietly paid out by an insurance policy Petter Lang happened to hold. Torvald had finally refused to sign the 4th claim and had told Petter so on a phone. Petter did not know was being logged by the company's own system. Someone needed Torvald gone before Monday's meeting, and someone who could make an engine room lie convincingly about how a man dies was worth more, quietly, than any amount of severance. Confronted with the roster, Rune said exactly 9 words. I worked alone. Nobody told me anything. Then nothing else for the rest of the crossing or the 3 days after it. Petter Lang produced a lawyer within the hour and an alibi within 2, and walked off that dock a free man with damp shoes and a dry conscience. Torvald's bag had gone into the bilge water with him, and the ledger inside it, the one that would have named every ship, every claim, every signature in Petter Lang's chain, had spent 6 hours dissolving in freezing salt water before anyone thought to open it. What came out was paper pulp and ink bled into illegible clouds. 3 years of proof reduced to something a lawyer could call unreliable in under a minute. Rune went into custody and stayed silent through all of it, worked alone. Nobody told me anything. A sentence he repeated so many times it stopped sounding like a lie and started sounding like a job description he had agreed to in advance. Petter Lang sent flowers to the funeral. I solved the case. Ask the harbor what that ledger would have been worth if the water had not gotten to it first. One corner of that ledger survived barely 3 lines of ink that had not quite given up, and on it, an abbreviation next to a shipping company neither Rune nor Petter would explain. 3 letters. I sat with those 3 letters until the coffee went cold, certain I had seen them somewhere before, and it took me until dawn to remember where. They are written, in the same faded hand, on the cover page of my father's old case file. The one about a ship this town closed 12 years ago and buried, and would very much like to keep buried. 2 bodies now, 12 years apart, and the same 3 letters standing over both of them like they never left. Cold North continues.